Hi, in this video, I'm going to teach you how to perform hypothesis testing. Now, in concept, we perform hypothesis testing to test a claim. A claim is something that could challenge what we call a certain belief in terms of the values that we know in the environment or in a given population. For instance, a current study or a previous study could be saying that the average sleeping hours of teenagers, maybe ages 15 to 19, their average sleeping hours is 7. And with that information, you feel that in the modern times, it is no longer 7. So you could claim that the average length of sleeping hours is no longer 7 or not equal to 7. Now, you cannot make that claim that will replace the status quo, what is already believed to be the average length of sleeping hours, without providing any statistical basis. So we need to perform some data gathering, we need to calculate some values, we need to perform this hypothesis testing before we can establish a new belief or possibly reject what is currently known. For instance, in my example, the average length of sleeping hours is known to be 7, and if you want to change that belief, we need to provide a statistical basis. And one way to do that is to perform a hypothesis testing. Now, if you will refer to different textbooks or resources, printed or online, they will discuss hypothesis testing through a series of steps. Now, in the testing procedure that I will be showing you in this video, we will number them step number 1 up to 5. That now, not all textbooks will number them as 1 to 5. Sometimes it is just 1 to 4 or maybe 1 to 6. But the key idea here is that all the steps should be done. All the process must be done, okay, in a certain sequence or in a certain order. Now again, so in this video, we will be using the 5 steps of the hypothesis testing in this version. And let's look at the first step. Now the first step when you perform a hypothesis testing is to set what we call a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Remember my example on the average sleeping hours, okay? And then you want to make a new claim about the number of sleeping hours. Those are our hypotheses. And later on, I'll show and explain in full what are these null and alternative hypotheses. But in terms of the steps, this will be our first step from the hypothesis testing. Now the next step, so after we know the null and alternative hypothesis of our study, we need to set what we call a significance level, alpha. So this is the alpha. This is very important when we perform a study or when we conduct a study, that we set what we call the significance level. Now in this step, we will be determining what type of tests we are going to use, which I will discuss later on. And then this is also where we have to gather some data to provide values that will be needed in the computation along the way when we perform the hypothesis test. And then we need to set what we call a decision rule. Okay, so that's our step number 2. Step number 3 will be the computation of what we call a test statistic. Now, before hypothesis testing, you were already, supposedly be exposed to what we call the z values and the t values. These values will be related later on to what we call a test statistic. And when I show you the formula, hopefully you will see the resemblance of the other formulas that have been discussed to you prior to hypothesis testing. After we compute the test statistic, we will be comparing what we call the value that we obtain in step number 3 and those with the critical values. Okay, and finally, after doing the comparison, we'll be writing our decision and make our conclusion. So these are the 5 steps. So in the next few minutes, I will be discussing them one by one. But again, focus on the sequence. Okay, when we perform a hypothesis testing with this approach, we will be following a 5-step version. Okay, so let us proceed to step number 1. Okay, this is where we set the null and alternative hypothesis. Again, when we say null and alternative hypothesis, the null is written as H sub 0 or H0, and the null hypothesis is the status quo. Status quo is what is known to be. Okay, for instance, the number of sleeping hours, the average sleeping hours, as my example earlier, the status quo say is 7 hours, so that will be our HO. Now, the alternative hypothesis is the one that will challenge, the status quo. To challenge means you do not agree anymore that the status quo is the average sleeping hours is 7, because you might feel that the students are now, or the teenagers are now, getting sleep less than 7 hours on the average. So that will be your alternative hypothesis, and this is the one that you want to support. You need to provide data that will support this so that you can reject what is currently the known information. Now, if the null hypothesis is denoted by H sub 0, the alternative hypothesis can be denoted as HA sub A or H1 or H sub 1. Okay, so these are the notation that you need to use when you set the null and alternative hypothesis. Now, let me show you an example. So down here, so our first example is, now, in my examples here, the HO is supposed to be the status quo. Okay, so HO, the average length of sleep in hours of teenagers aged 15 to 19 is 7 hours. So we can simplify that null hypothesis by writing HO is mu equal to 7. The mu, as we know, is the symbol for the population mean. Now, this is very important that when we simplify the writing of HO or H1, we have to use the symbol for the parameters. Parameters are the values taken from the population. So as you can see, we are not using X bar here when we state our null and alternative hypothesis. Do not use X bar, do not use S for standard deviation, because these are measures taken from a sample. So whenever you write the null and alternative hypothesis, you have to use the parameters, the mu, the sigma for the standard deviation, the sigma squared for the variance. Okay, now, so an example of an alternative hypothesis would be, the alternative hypothesis is or will depend on what you want to challenge the HO. So if you feel that it is no longer 7 hours, then your alternative hypothesis will be the average length of sleep of teenagers is not 7 hours. And in symbol, H1 or HA is not, so mu is not equal to 7. Okay, now, in my first example, I showed here an H1 to be not equal to 7 hours. Now, you can still have an HO saying 7 hours, but you could challenge this and say that it could be greater than 7 or it could be less than 7. So a mu equal to 7 null hypothesis can have 3 possible alternative hypotheses. Now that will depend on your objective. Are you trying to show that it's no longer 7? Are you trying to show that it is greater than 7? Or are you trying to show that it is less than 7? It will depend. Okay, now next example. Now in other cases, the HO is not written in terms of an exact equality. Maybe what is known is that the average sleeping hours is more than or equal to 7, or in other words, it's at least 7 hours. So that can be a null hypothesis. So as we can see here, not all null hypotheses will have exactly mu is equal to a given number. Sometimes it's an inequality. But one thing to note when you use inequality is that between HO and H1, the inequality that contains the equal sign should always be with the null hypothesis. The equal sign, the greater than or equal, okay, should always be with the null hypothesis. Okay, later on we will encounter examples in which statements can be confusing, and they will ask you to write the null and alternative hypothesis. The key is to write the null hypothesis by using the statement that says an equality. Okay, if it is not a status quo, but the statement is saying greater than or equal, less than or equal, then that will be our statement for the null hypothesis. Now, so what will challenge this null hypothesis now that we have a greater than or equal to 7? Then there's just one possible option, and that is the opposite or the reverse of greater than or equal to 7, which is less than 7. So this is opposed to my first example in which you have the equal sign. When you have the equal sign, it could have three possible alternative hypotheses. It could be not equal to the number, greater than the number, or less than the number. But when we start with an inequality, then the alternative hypothesis should be the exact opposite. Okay, so since we have written the equal sign, there is no reason for you to write the equal sign in the less than 7. So the alternative hypothesis is that the population mean is less than 7. And that will be the same for a null hypothesis that is, what is currently the belief is that the number of sleeping hours is less than or equal to 7, or at most 7. Then if there is a community or there's a group of students that feel like it's not at most 7, they are still sleeping more than 7 hours, then the alternative hypothesis that will challenge the known belief is that the mu is greater than 7. As we can see, the average length of sleep of teenagers ages 15 to 19 is higher than 7 hours. And that's how you set your null and alternative hypothesis. To summarize this step, the null is the HO, which is the status quo, or in other examples, it's the statement that contains the equal sign. And then the HA or H1 is our alternative hypothesis, the one that challenges the status quo that is being stated in the null hypothesis. Okay? Now, this is the first step of the hypothesis testing, but I want to save time for this video, so the next step will be created in another video. So this lesson will be a series of videos that will complete all the steps from 1, the null and alternative hypothesis writing, up to the 5th step, which is the creation of the decision and conclusion. Okay, so for now, I'll cut the video here. So far what we have covered is the basic concepts surrounding hypothesis testing, why we do it, what are the general steps, and the step number 1. Okay, so please go to the playlist and check the step number 2 or the part 2 of the hypothesis testing series. So that's all for now. Thank you.